My name is David Cohen, and I am 58 years old. I have spent my entire life in New York, serving as a rabbi and teacher of the Torah. For decades, I devoted myself to the study of Jewish law, guiding my community, and preserving the traditions of my ancestors. I believed in the covenant between God and Israel, in the sacred duty to uphold his commandments, and in the importance of remaining faithful to our heritage. But what I'm about to tell you is something I never expected, something that changed everything. I thought I knew about faith, truth, and God himself. It began on a cold winter evening in Manhattan. I had been invited to a theological debate at a local synagogue where scholars from different backgrounds gathered to discuss religious doctrines. These debates were not uncommon, and I had participated in many before. I was well-versed, confident, and unshaken in my beliefs. That night, the topic was one I had encountered many times before. Is Jesus the Messiah? I had heard the arguments, dismissed them, and was prepared once again to refute them with logic, scripture, and tradition. The room was filled with rabbis, scholars, and students, their eyes focused on the speakers at the front. The discussion was civil at first, an exchange of ideas and interpretations, but as the conversation deepened, so did the intensity. I found myself engaged in a heated debate with a Messianic Jew, a man who had once been like me, but had come to believe that Jesus was the fulfillment of the prophecies in the Torah. He was articulate, knowledgeable, and passionate. He quoted Isaiah, Zechariah, and Daniel, drawing connections I had spent my life dismissing. I countered his arguments with confidence, citing centuries of rabbinic interpretation, refuting his claims with the authority of tradition. But as I spoke, something strange began to happen. A sharp pain shot through my chest, deep and crushing. At first, I thought it was stress, the intensity of the debate getting the best of me. I clenched my fist, willing the discomfort to pass, but it only grew worse. My breath became shallow, my vision blurred. I tried to steady myself, gripping the podium as the words in my mouth became harder to form. My opponent paused, concern flashing in his eyes. Someone in the audience murmured something, but their voices were distant, muffled, as if I were suddenly underwater. My heart pounded erratically, a forceful drumbeat against my ribs, until, snap, I felt my knees buckle. The world tilted. The ceiling lights blurred into streaks of white. Then everything went black. For a moment there was nothing. No pain, no noise, no sensation, just an empty, vast silence. But I was still aware. I didn't know how, but I knew I still existed. Then, as if someone had lifted a veil, I opened my eyes, or at least what I thought were my eyes. I was no longer in my body. I was above it, floating, watching. Below me, the room was chaos. People were rushing, voices rising in panic. Someone had caught me before I hit the ground, laying me down gently. A man pressed 2 fingers to my neck, shaking his head. Another shouted for an ambulance. My wife, Miriam, was suddenly there, pushing through the crowd, her face twisted in terror. I wanted to reach out to her, to reassure her, to tell her I was still here, but my hands, if I even had them, wouldn't respond. I turned, expecting to see the synagogue walls around me, but they were fading. Everything was growing dim, not into darkness, but into something else. And then I saw it, a light. Not like the artificial glow of lamps or the harsh glare of the sun. This light was alive. It pulsed, radiated, moved, as if it were breathing. It wasn't coming from a single source. It was everywhere, wrapping around me with a warmth that seeped into my very being. It wasn't just light. It was presence. It knew me. It recognized me. And it was calling me forward. I felt myself drawn toward it, not against my will, but as if it were the most natural thing in the world. All the fears I should have felt, the confusion, the panic of seeing my own body lifeless below me, were gone. There was only peace. But just as I began to surrender to it, something pulled me back. A voice, faint, distant, familiar. Miriam. She was sobbing, clutching my hand, pleading with the paramedics. Please, bring him back. Don't stop. I felt the weight of her words, tethering me to the world I had just left behind. A part of me wanted to stay, to let go, to follow the light that filled me with indescribable peace. But another part, the part that still belonged to her, to my children, to the life I had built, held me back. The light did not fade. It did not force me forward. It simply waited. And in that waiting, I realized this was only the beginning. I hovered above the chaos, weightless, untethered, yet fully aware of everything unfolding below me. My body lay motionless on the floor, surrounded by frantic movement, people shouting, paramedics rushing in, the sound of my wife's desperate cries cutting through the commotion. I should have felt panic. I should have felt fear. But instead, there was calm, a peace so profound that it silenced every thought, every worry, every instinct that told me I should fight to stay alive. The paramedics moved quickly, their hands pressing down on my chest, their voices sharp and urgent. "He's not breathing," one of them called out. Another reached for the defibrillator, the paddles charging with a piercing whine. Someone counted down. A jolt of electricity surged through my lifeless form, making my body arch violently before collapsing again. But I felt nothing. I wasn't there. I was here, floating, observing, separate from the flesh and blood that had defined me for nearly 6 decades. Then I turned my gaze from the scene below to what lay beyond. The walls of the synagogue blurred, dissolving into something vast, endless, indescribable. The world I had known, the reality I had built my entire life around, was slipping away, replaced by something greater. And at the center of it all, the light remained. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, soft yet radiant, warm yet weightless, both near and impossibly far. It wasn't just brightness, it was presence. It filled the space around me, seeped into me, called to me without words, yet with an authority that left no room for doubt. It wasn't demanding, it wasn't forcing me forward. It simply waited, patient and knowing, as if it had always been there, watching, waiting for me to finally notice. I felt the pull again, stronger this time, an unspoken invitation to move closer, to step beyond the threshold of the existence I had always known. A part of me resisted. My entire life had been rooted in the tangible, the teachings of the Torah, the structured laws and traditions passed down through generations. The afterlife, the nature of God's presence, these were things I had discussed, debated, taught, but never truly experienced, until now. Doubt flickered in my mind, the last remnant of my earthly self clinging to the familiar. Was this real? Was this simply a hallucination, a final firing of neurons in a dying brain? But even as the thoughts formed, I knew the answer. This was real, more real than anything I had ever known. The light pulsed gently, as if acknowledging my hesitation, yet offering something far beyond understanding. It wasn't merely a place, it was a presence, alive, aware, intentional. It knew me. It had always known me. And for the first time in my life, I realized I had spent so many years searching for God without ever truly standing before Him. I drifted forward, the space between me and the light shrinking, my awareness expanding. Every step, if I could call it that, unraveled the weight of my past, the expectations, the teachings, the rigid understanding of faith I had clung to for so long. The closer I came, the more I felt something being stripped away, not my identity, not my beliefs, but my misconceptions. Then, just as I neared the edge of the unknown, a voice, deep, resounding. It wasn't heard, it was felt. "David, have you truly known me?" The words struck like thunder, not in anger, not in judgment, but in truth. And in that moment, standing between two worlds, I understood something that shattered everything I thought I knew. I had spent my life studying God, teaching about Him, defending His laws. But had I ever truly known Him? The answer terrified me. The voice echoed through me, not with sound, but with something deeper, something that resonated in the very core of my being. "David, have you truly known me?" The words carried weight, not as an accusation, not as condemnation, but as an undeniable truth being laid bare before me. I wanted to answer. I wanted to say yes. I had spent my entire life studying God, teaching others about Him, defending His name, reciting His laws. But as I stood there, stripped of all pretense, I realized the terrifying possibility that I had never truly known Him at all. A flood of images surrounded me, scenes from my life unfolding with absolute clarity. I saw myself as a young man, hunched over sacred texts, poring over every letter of the Torah, dissecting every commandment, memorizing every law. I had been devoted, disciplined, determined to uphold the traditions passed down through generations. I had built my life on knowledge, on certainty, on the belief that my understanding of God was complete. But as I watched these moments play out, I saw something I had never noticed before. I saw myself arguing, debating, defending theology with a heart full of pride, more concerned with proving others wrong than with seeking deeper truth. I saw countless conversations where I dismissed Jesus, not with careful thought, but with immediate rejection, refusing to even entertain the possibility that he could be who his followers claimed he was. I had closed myself off, not out of wisdom, but out of fear of what it might mean if I had been wrong. I saw myself leading prayers, conducting services, offering counsel, always respected, always revered. Yet now, watching from outside of time, I could feel the emptiness that had existed beneath it all. My faith had been built on tradition, on structure, on obedience. But had I ever truly sought him? Had I ever asked, with an open heart, "Who are you, Lord?" I fell to my knees, though there was no ground beneath me. The weight of realization was crushing, not because I was being punished, but because I finally saw myself for what I was. A man who had spent a lifetime believing he understood God, yet had never truly stood before him. I lifted my face toward the vastness, toward the light that pulsed around me, still waiting, still inviting. "Lord," I whispered, my voice shaking, "I thought I knew you." The words tasted hollow as they left my lips. The presence did not waver. There was no anger, no rebuke, only that same piercing question. "Have you truly known me?" Tears burned my eyes, but I could not look away. I didn't know the answer, and that terrified me more than anything else. The images around me shifted. Now I was seeing the scriptures I had spent a lifetime studying, but they were alive, unfolding in ways I had never perceived before. I saw Abraham on Mount Moriah, raising the knife over Isaac, but now I understood it was a foreshadowing of something greater. I saw Moses lifting the bronze serpent in the wilderness, healing those who looked upon it, a reflection of something yet to come. I saw Isaiah's suffering servant, pierced for our transgressions, bearing the weight of our iniquities. And then the light grew even brighter. A figure began to emerge within it, a presence I had denied my entire life. And yet in that moment, I knew exactly who he was. Jesus. The light was overwhelming, but it did not burn. It did not blind. It was pure, alive, drawing me toward it with a presence so immense, so utterly beyond human comprehension, yet deeply personal. And in the center of it, a figure took shape. At first, I could barely comprehend what I was seeing. His presence was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Majestic, yet intimate, powerful, yet full of gentleness. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, I knew. Not through logic, not through doctrine, but through something deeper, something undeniable. Jesus. The name alone sent a shock through me, a name I had spent my entire life dismissing, debating against, refuting, rejecting. And yet, as I stood in the radiance of his presence, all the arguments, all the theological defenses I had clung to crumbled to dust. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell myself this wasn't real, that it was some illusion, some trick of the mind. But I couldn't. I couldn't deny what I was seeing, what I was feeling. The truth of his existence, his identity, his divinity, was more real than anything I had ever known. He didn't speak at first, yet his gaze pierced into the deepest parts of my soul. And in that gaze, I saw everything. I saw every time I had closed my heart to him, every moment I had dismissed his followers, every time I had scoffed at the idea that he could be the fulfillment of the scriptures I had spent my life studying. I saw every moment of my life laid bare, not as condemnation, but as truth. And in that truth, I saw the greatest sorrow of all, not that I had rejected him, but that he had loved me, even when I did. Finally, he spoke. "David, you have sought truth, but have you been willing to see it?" His voice was steady, filled with authority, yet it held no anger, no judgment, only sorrow and love. I wanted to answer, to say that I had spent my life seeking God, serving him, teaching his commandments. But the words stuck in my throat, because I knew the truth. I had sought knowledge. I had sought tradition. But had I truly sought him? I looked down, unable to hold his gaze any longer. My entire life flashed before me again, but this time through his eyes. And I saw the moments I had missed, the moments where he had been calling me, reaching for me, but I had turned away. Tears burned my eyes. My knees gave out beneath me, and I fell, my heart breaking under the weight of everything I had refused to see. I didn't know, I whispered. I didn't know it was you. Jesus stepped closer. The light around him didn't just shine. It radiated love, a love so deep, so absolute, that it shattered every defense I had left. You have always known, he said. It has been written, it has been spoken, but your heart would not see. I gasped, the realization crashing over me like a tidal wave. It had always been there. The prophecies, the foreshadowing, the suffering servant of Isaiah, the pierced one in Zechariah, the Lamb of Passover, the Messiah who was rejected, despised, yet bore the sins of many. It had always been him, and I had missed it. I had missed him. Sobs racked my body. For the first time in my life, I had nothing to hold on to. No arguments, no traditions, no pride, only the undeniable truth standing before me. And all I could do was weep. Jesus knelt beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder. A warmth spread through me, not just physical, but spiritual, reaching into the very core of who I was. The Torah is not void, he said softly. It is fulfilled. His words pierced me deeper than any blade could. Every law, every festival, every prophecy, they had all pointed to him. I had spent my life waiting for the Messiah, but he had already come. I lifted my face, tears streaming down. What do I do? My voice was barely a whisper. Jesus looked into my eyes, and in that gaze I saw something beyond time, beyond space, a love so great that it had endured my rejection, my blindness, my stubbornness, a love that had never once turned away from me. And then he spoke the words that would change my life forever. Return, David, and tell them. Before I could respond, before I could even process what he had said, everything around me shifted. The light faded. The warmth withdrew. The presence of Jesus, overwhelming and undeniable, began to pull away. I tried to hold on, tried to stay, but something was pulling me back, dragging me away from the radiance, away from the presence that had just unraveled everything I had ever believed. And then I woke up. I gasped, a violent surge of air flooding my lungs as if I had been drowning and had just broken through the surface. Pain shot through my chest. My limbs felt heavy, and my head pounded with a dull, throbbing ache. The harsh glare of fluorescent lights burned my eyes, and the muffled hum of machines filled the room. For a moment, I was disoriented, caught between two worlds, the overwhelming light I had just left behind and the sterile reality of a hospital room. Then I heard a voice. David? I turned my head slowly, every movement feeling sluggish, my body still reeling from the shock of being alive. Miriam stood at my bedside, her hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the mattress. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and fear etched into her features. She looked like she had been crying for hours. You came back, she whispered, as if she couldn't believe it. I blinked, trying to process her words, but my mind was still in the place I had just left. My throat felt raw, and when I finally managed to speak, my voice was hoarse. How long? She swallowed hard, then glanced at the heart monitor beside me. You were gone, David. You were dead. Her voice broke on the last word, and a fresh wave of tears filled her eyes. No pulse, no breath. They tried to revive you for over 15 minutes. They were about to stop. 15 minutes. My body had been lifeless for 15 minutes. Yet where I had been, time had not existed. The weight of that realization pressed into my chest, heavier than any pain I felt physically. Miriam, I rasped, reaching for her hand. I saw him. She stilled, her fingers tightening around mine. Who? I took a slow, shaky breath, trying to find the words. But how could I explain what I had seen? How could I put into words the overwhelming presence, the undeniable truth, the way my soul had been laid bare before him? But as I looked into her eyes, I knew I couldn't stay silent. Jesus. The moment the name left my lips, her entire body stiffened. Her grip on my hand loosened, her face paling even more. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, David. I tried to sit up, but a sharp pain lanced through my chest, forcing me back down. Miriam, listen to me. She took a step back. You must be confused. You went through something traumatic. Maybe your mind. No, My voice was stronger now, certainty replacing the fog of exhaustion. I saw him. I stood before him, and Miriam, he is the Messiah. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of relief. They were of fear. David, stop. I can't. Emotion tightened my throat. I spent my entire life studying the Torah, searching for truth, defending what I believed. But I was blind. Everything I was shown, it all pointed to him. He was there from the beginning. Every prophecy, every sacrifice, every shadow of what was to come, it was all fulfilled in him. She pressed a shaking hand to her mouth, her body trembling. Do you even hear yourself? She choked out. You're saying everything we have lived by, everything we have taught our children, everything we have believed, it was all wrong? I closed my eyes for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Not wrong, I said softly. Incomplete. A sob escaped her lips, and she turned away, gripping the back of the chair beside her as if it were the only thing holding her up. I can't do this, she whispered. I can't listen to this. Miriam, please. I reached out for her again, but she took another step back. I need time, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need time to think. Then she turned and walked out of the room. I stared after her, my heart aching in a way that had nothing to do with my body's weakness. I had expected resistance. I had expected doubt. But watching the woman I had loved for decades walk away from me, from what I had just experienced, felt like a wound deeper than anything I had ever known. I leaned back against the pillow, my breath shaky. I had lost my congregation. I had lost the certainty I had once clung to, and now I might lose my family. But I had seen him, and I could not deny the truth. No matter the cost. The hospital room felt colder after Miriam left. The beeping of the monitors, the distant murmur of nurses outside my door, the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen line, all of it blurred into the background as I stared at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened. My body was weak, but my mind was sharp, clearer than it had ever been. I had seen Jesus. I had stood before him, and I knew without a shadow of doubt that he was the Messiah. But now I was back in a world that would refuse to believe it, a world that would fight against everything I had been shown. The door creaked open, pulling me from my thoughts. My son Ezra stepped inside, his face tight with worry. He was 30, strong in his faith, a devoted husband and father, and a man I had raised to cherish the Torah as I had. He had always admired me, respected me. But as he approached my bed, I saw something else in his eyes now. Dad, he said, his voice quiet, careful. Mom told me what you said. I exhaled slowly, bracing myself. And what do you think? He hesitated, pulling a chair close but not sitting down. He crossed his arms, glancing toward the hallway as if ensuring no one else could hear. I think you went through something traumatic. I think your mind is still trying to process it. I shook my head. Ezra, it wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. I was there. I saw him. His jaw tightened. Dad, you had a near-death experience. The brain does strange things when it's shutting down. Visions, bright lights, even seeing religious figures, it's all been documented. I pushed myself up slightly, ignoring the pain in my chest. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't dreaming. This was real, more real than anything I've ever known. Jesus is the fulfillment of everything we've been waiting for, everything we've studied, everything we've believed. Ezra flinched as if I had struck him. Do you hear yourself? He whispered harshly. You're saying that our entire faith, our entire history, everything we've dedicated our lives to was incomplete? That we've been waiting for someone who already came and we missed it? I swallowed hard. Yes. He took a step back, rubbing a hand over his face. Dad, you're a rabbi. You've spent your whole life teaching the Torah, defending it, and now you expect me to believe that in one moment everything changed? It didn't change, I said firmly. It was revealed. Ezra, I saw the prophecies unfold before me. I saw how every word, every law, every sacrifice pointed to him. I saw how Isaiah's suffering servant wasn't just poetic imagery, it was Jesus. I saw how the binding of Isaac was a foreshadowing of what was to come. The truth was always there, but we refused to see it. His face contorted with something between anger and heartbreak. No, he muttered, shaking his head. No, I won't accept that. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Ezra, please, just listen. If you trust me, if you've ever respected my teachings, then hear me now. Seek the truth for yourself. Don't reject it because it scares you. He stepped back toward the door, his movements stiff. I don't know who you are right now, he said quietly, but you're not the father I grew up with. And then he was gone. I sat there, staring at the empty doorway, feeling the weight of everything I had just lost pressing down on me. First Miriam, now Ezra. My own family couldn't bear to hear what I had to say. They weren't just rejecting my words, they were rejecting me. But hadn't I done the same? Hadn't I dismissed those who tried to tell me the truth? Hadn't I shut my ears to the possibility that Jesus was who he claimed to be? Hadn't I turned my back on those who believed in him, convinced they were misguided? And now, here I was, alone. A nurse entered a few minutes later, checking my IV, adjusting the machines, asking if I needed anything. I shook my head, my voice too thick to speak. I needed my wife. I needed my son. I needed my family to listen. But more than that, I needed to decide what came next, because I knew the truth now, and I had a choice. I could stay silent, keep it to myself, try to rebuild my life with Miriam and Ezra, pretending that nothing had changed. I could let the fear of losing them keep me from speaking out, or I could obey. I could do what Jesus had commanded me, return, and tell them. The thought sent a shiver through me. I had lost so much already, but I had a feeling I would lose even more if I did what I knew I had to do. I closed my eyes, letting out a slow breath. The cost was high, but the truth was worth it. The day I left the hospital, the world outside felt different. The same streets, the same buildings, the same city I had lived in my entire life. Yet something had shifted. Or maybe it was me. I had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at truth. But with that truth came a cost, one I was only beginning to understand. Miriam barely spoke to me on the drive home. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly, her face unreadable. I wanted to reach for her, to reassure her, to somehow make her understand what had happened to me. But I knew the words wouldn't come easily. When we pulled up to our apartment building, she turned off the engine but didn't move. "David," she said finally, her voice tight, measured. "I need you to understand something." I waited, my heart pounding. "This thing you're saying, this vision, this experience." She took a shaky breath. "I don't know what it was, but I do know this. Our faith, our life, our family, it's built on something real, something true. And what you're saying, it threatens everything." I swallowed, my throat dry. "Miriam, I'm not trying to destroy our faith. I'm trying to fulfill it. What I saw, what I learned, it doesn't erase the Torah, it completes it." She shook her head, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I can't follow you down this path." The finality in her words hit me like a blow. She stepped out of the car before I could respond, slamming the door behind her. I sat there for a long time, staring at the dashboard, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on me. First Ezra, now Miriam. I had expected resistance, but I hadn't expected to feel so alone. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do now? How could I tell people what I had seen if even my own family refused to hear it? But deep inside, I knew the answer. I had to speak. The next morning, I made a decision. I would go back to the synagogue, to the very place where I had collapsed, and tell them what had happened. If I had lost my family, if my congregation rejected me, if the world thought I was insane, so be it. The truth was worth it. I walked into the synagogue and immediately felt the weight of 100 eyes on me. Conversations hushed, people whispered behind their hands. It wasn't just my sudden return that had them watching. It was what I had said in the hospital, the rumors that had already begun to spread. Rabbi Goldman, a senior leader in our community, approached me with cautious concern. "David," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "we've been praying for you, but we've also heard things." I met his gaze. "Then let me tell you what really happened." A small group gathered as I recounted my experience. I told them about leaving my body, about the light, about Jesus standing before me, revealing the fulfillment of the Torah. I expected outrage. I expected dismissal, but what I saw was worse, pity. Goldman sighed heavily. David, I know you believe you experienced something profound, but you were unconscious. The brain, I shook my head. No, this wasn't a dream. This wasn't a hallucination. I stood before him. He is the Messiah. A murmur rippled through the room. Some looked away. Others shifted uncomfortably. Then someone stood up. Blasphemy! The voice was sharp, filled with anger. A younger rabbi, his face red with fury. You insult our people, our history, everything we have fought to preserve. Another man nodded. If you truly believe this, you have no place here. Goldman raised a hand for silence, his face pained. David, we respect you. We care about you. But if you continue down this path, you will force us to take action. I exhaled slowly. You mean excommunication? A long silence. Then finally, Goldman nodded. Yes. The words should have shaken me. They should have filled me with fear. But instead, all I felt was a deep, steady peace. I understand, I said. With that, I turned and walked out. The doors of the synagogue closed behind me, and for the first time in my life, I was truly alone. But I had never felt freer. The cold air hit my face as I stepped outside the synagogue. The weight of what had just happened settled deep in my chest, but there was no regret. I had spoken the truth. I had done what I was meant to do. Yet in doing so, I had lost everything. My congregation, my standing, my community. I knew there was no going back. I walked through the streets of New York, my mind racing. The city moved around me as it always had. Cars honking, people rushing by, conversations blending into a dull hum. Life continued as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything was different. I no longer belonged to the world I had known. I had crossed a line, stepped into something new, something terrifying and uncertain. That night, I sat alone in my apartment. Miriam had taken our son and gone to stay with her parents. The emptiness of the space pressed in on me, but I refused to let it consume me. I reached for the Tanakh on my bookshelf, the sacred scriptures I had spent my entire life studying. My fingers traced the worn cover before I opened it to Isaiah 53. I had read this passage hundreds of times before, but now the words leapt off the page with a meaning I had never allowed myself to see. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and by his wounds we are healed. Tears burned my eyes as I let the words sink in. It was so clear now. How had I missed it? How had I spent my entire life studying the Torah, the prophets, the wisdom of the sages, yet never seen the truth standing in front of me? I had a choice to make. I could stay silent, try to rebuild my life, try to salvage what little remained of my family and reputation, or I could do what Jesus had commanded me, return and tell them. I wiped my eyes and reached for my phone. The next morning, I made a public announcement. I would be sharing my testimony at a small church in Brooklyn, a place I had never stepped foot in before. I knew that by doing this, I was sealing my fate. But I also knew that I could not keep silent. When I arrived, the room was nearly full. Some were there out of curiosity, others to mock, and a few, just a few, had come because something in them was stirring. The same way something had stirred in me. I stepped up to the podium, looking out at the faces before me. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice was strong. I was a rabbi, I began. I spent my life studying the Torah, teaching the commandments, upholding the traditions of my ancestors. I was convinced that I knew the truth. I was convinced that Jesus was not the Messiah. A hush fell over the room. But then I died. Gasps, whispers. Some people leaned forward. Others crossed their arms. I stood outside of my body, watched as the doctors tried to revive me, and then I was drawn into a light that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was not just light, it was presence. And in that presence, I encountered the one I had spent my life rejecting. A man in the front row narrowed his eyes. And you expect us to believe that? I met his gaze. I don't expect you to believe anything. I only ask that you listen. I told them everything, how Jesus had stood before me, how he had shown me the fulfillment of every prophecy, every promise. I told them how I had spent my life searching for the truth, only to realize that the truth had already come and I had refused to see it. Some listened with tears in their eyes. Others shook their heads in disbelief, and some, just as I had once done, got up and walked out. But I had done what I came to do. I had told them, and now the rest was in God's hands.